The first indications of the world in which the narrative unfolds emerge not through dramatic announcements but through the slow accumulation of routines that have taken root in a remote sector of the Siberian Taiga, a region so inaccessible that even military satellites sweep across it without adjusting their trajectories, and where the forest absorbs radio signals with the same indifference it applies to the remains of abandoned equipment. The late autumn season brings no vivid colors or dramatic storms. Instead, it imposes a steady pressure of cold that infiltrates prefabricated walls and causes the metal joints of temporary research modules to contract, creaking softly at night in a manner that resembles muffled footsteps in an adjacent corridor. The research base, assembled by necessity rather than design, contains offices cramped with metal desks coated in a fine layer of dust, typewriters whose keys no longer strike with uniform force, and filing cabinets that require physical effort to open because their tracks have warped over the years. Nothing in the environment feels new, and even the items that technically are new, generator parts delivered from Novosibirsk, unused geological kits, stacks of graph paper still bound in manufacturer's packaging, appear prematurely aged by the atmosphere of bureaucratic neglect. It is in this context that Andrei Lavrov, a senior geophysicist from the Academy of Sciences, performs his tasks with the quiet discipline of someone who has existed for decades inside institutional systems that reward caution far more consistently than they reward initiative. His movements possess an unspoken calculation. He reads each memo twice before signing. He sorts soil samples in an order that mirrors the structure of his reporting obligations rather than the logic of scientific curiosity. And he stores his notebooks in a locked compartment not because the information is sensitive, but because experience has taught him that misplaced documents often produce complications more dangerous than missing data. When colleagues speak to him, he tends to answer after a short pause, using those seconds to evaluate whether the question carries a hidden dimension. Even when he expresses agreement, his tone contains a subtle neutrality, as if he has learned to inhabit the exact space between sincerity and detachment. His past is never narrated directly. Instead, it becomes perceptible in the reflexes that shape his present. His tendency to glance at doorways before beginning sensitive discussions, his instinctive avoidance of hypothetical statements, and the way he lowers his voice whenever mentioning administrative irregularities. The other members of the expedition appear within this procedural framework rather than outside it. Elena, the anthropologist, enters scenes quietly, often standing just out of direct light, reviewing her field notes with a precision that suggests she expects them to be examined by someone other than herself. Her voice rarely rises above the background hum of the generators, and she structures her observations in a conditional manner that creates an impression of distance. Phrases such as "it may indicate," "it is possible that," "one could infer," as though direct assertions might lead to questions she prefers not to answer. Kirill, the engineer responsible for temporal monitoring equipment, maintains a personal orderliness that borders on defensive discipline. His workstation is arranged with exact symmetry, but his posture stiffens whenever someone requests clarification about the calibration history of his instruments. Timur, the youngest member of the group, approaches tasks with an uneasy eagerness that reveals more about his anxiety than his ambition. He checks instructions repeatedly, overcompensates with overly formal language, and watches the senior staff with the attentiveness of a trainee trying to decipher rules that are never formally communicated. The daily rhythm of the base reinforces the impression that this enclave in the Taiga functions less as a scientific outpost and more as a satellite of an administrative system whose presence is felt primarily through documents, signatures, and silence. Each morning begins with the mechanical clatter of typewriter keys in the shared office, a sound that competes with the slow rotation of a ceiling fan struggling against accumulated dust. Reports must be filed before midday, even when there is nothing new to report, because the procedural timeline predates all current personnel and cannot be altered without paperwork that would raise questions in distant departments. Guards patrol the corridors not with suspicion but with the resigned thoroughness of employees whose jobs are structured around routines rather than threats. Their boots make a muted thud on the linoleum floors, and their gestures, though minimal, convey the expectation that those who pass by them will not draw attention to themselves. Conversations remain short, because time spent speaking represents time during which one might be overheard. Within this structured environment, the first signs of an approaching disturbance emerge not as an event but as a pattern of deviations too subtle to be considered official but too consistent to ignore. A meteorological report that usually arrives at precisely 9 o'clock is delivered 2 hours late with no accompanying explanation. A supply shipment includes 3 additional crates not listed on the manifest, each marked with a faded military stenciling referencing a department that no longer exists. A corridor commonly used by logistics staff remains inexplicably empty for several consecutive days, leading some to speculate, not aloud, but through shared glances, that certain personnel have been reassigned without notice. Lavrov notices that several forms have been stamped with an unfamiliar seal, one not present in previous months' documentation. The seal's edges appear uneven, suggesting improper maintenance, as though it had been retrieved from storage after years of disuse. These anomalies do not generate open discussion. Instead, they create a shift in the atmosphere, a quiet recalibration of behavior. Conversations become shorter. People pass documents hand-to-hand rather than leaving them on communal desks. The rarely used fax machine in the administrative office is checked more frequently, even when no one expects incoming transmissions. Timur begins avoiding the storage corridor entirely, though he provides no reason. Elena starts taking longer walks around the perimeter under the pretext of verifying environmental markers, though her gaze seems fixed on structures rather than the landscape. Kirill appears increasingly tense, occasionally pausing in the middle of tasks as though listening for something beyond ordinary hearing. No one articulates a theory, yet everyone adjusts their conduct to account for the possibility that the routine is being shaped by decisions made in a distant office whose occupants they will never meet. Lavrov feels these shifts more acutely than the others, perhaps because his career has accustomed him to reading institutional changes not through orders or announcements but through the small distortions that appear before official explanations materialize. He senses that the expedition's operating parameters have begun to shift, though the shift has not yet been formalized. He observes that certain files once housed in the central cabinet have been moved to a drawer requiring special authorization, though no memo announced the change. He notices that the patrol schedule has doubled its night rotations, a decision that could only have come from higher authority. He begins cataloging these changes internally, not as evidence but as a form of protection, an unofficial record he may one day need to rely on if questioned about his actions during this period. The environment beyond the base reflects the same muted tension. The Taiga itself, normally a source of indifference bordering on hostility, begins to take on the qualities of a space surveilled not by nature but by institutions. Snowfall reveals tracks near an old access road that has not been used in years, suggesting recent passage of a vehicle that did not register through the base's logistics. The air carries a faint echo of machinery operating at a distance, too intermittent to identify. It is Elena who first remarks, in her careful, conditioned tone, that the pattern of these sounds resembles the activity of a facility attempting to restart dormant equipment. Kirill dismisses the suggestion outwardly, but Lavrov notices that he begins locking up his instruments earlier than usual, as though suspecting they might draw unwanted attention. What grows is not fear but a heightened alertness, the sense that their routines are now running parallel to some other operation whose details remain inaccessible. Administrative irregularities accumulate, not rapidly enough to provoke alarm but with sufficient consistency to form a pattern. Certain communication frequencies begin experiencing interference. A field assistant from another sector arrives unexpectedly with questions that do not match his official role. An internal memo references temporal inconsistencies without context, using language that seems repurposed from previous eras. The sense of an unspoken threat emerges from these contradictions, not through narrative escalation but through the logic of systems whose silences communicate more than their directives. Lavrov understands that such irregularities often precede the revelation of classified operations, projects shielded by decades of secrecy and protected by layers of obsolete protocols. He recalls, though only in fragments, similar shifts earlier in his career, instances when small anomalies preceded the disclosure of operations that had been hidden from even senior researchers. Yet he also knows that memory is unreliable in institutional environments, distorted by the necessity of forgetting what cannot be safely retained. His recognition of patterns does not manifest as certainty but as an internal tension, a sense that he is standing on the periphery of an invisible perimeter whose boundaries tighten with every passing day. As late autumn settles deeper into the region, the base begins to feel like a structure suspended between visibility and disappearance. Generators operate with slightly irregular pulses, typewriters jam more frequently as if resisting further documentation, and the narrow hallways carry echoes that seem delayed by a fraction of a second. The staff adhere to routines with greater rigidity, as though trying to anchor themselves against an emerging disruption that has not yet been named. It is in this atmosphere of growing constraint, shaped by silence rather than declaration, that the narrative prepares to shift toward the first undeniable evidence of the anomaly, the discovery of an abandoned GRU bunker within the restricted perimeter, a structure whose existence has been omitted from every official map. For now, however, it remains only an implication felt across paperwork, absence, and hesitation, a presence that reveals itself not through discovery but through the distortions it creates in the everyday logic of institutional life. The helicopters left them at the fractured edge of the Taiga just past dawn, their rotors cutting the air with a violence that felt out of place against the dull, mist-soft landscape. As the sound faded, the forest exhaled, long, cold, indifferent, swallowing the scientific expedition in a silence that was almost accusatory. Dr. Elena Markova stood still for a moment, letting the damp wind settle into her coat. The trees around her seemed unnaturally still, their needles unmoving, as if waiting. She had sensed strange atmospheres in the field before, charged places where geology or magnetic anomalies played tricks on the brain, but this, she thought, this felt personal. Ahead, the ground dipped in a half-natural, half-engineered scar, the collapsed entrance to the GRU bunker that the Academy's archival research had rediscovered only 3 months prior. She and her team had been sent to assess the structure, determine its contents, and, more importantly, investigate the anomalous timestamps embedded in the declassified satellite photographs, shadows cast in the wrong direction, debris patterns inconsistent with gravity, and one haunting frame, a fallen ladder frozen mid-air like a suspended exhale. It was that photo that had kept Elena awake for nights. It looked impossible, but impossibility had long ceased to exist as a barrier in her field. Dr. Taras Koval, her second-in-command and closest intellectual rival, clambered down the slope with an enthusiasm that rubbed against the atmosphere like sandpaper. He was always more eager than cautious, a trait Elena admired in closed laboratories but feared in the field. Behind him, the structural engineer Petrov and the twins, Anya and Mitya, the expedition's geomapping specialists, unfolded equipment cases with the ritualistic precision of monks laying out relics. They had no idea that they were approaching a place where cause and effect had divorced, where time itself had begun to behave like a wounded animal retreating into a dark burrow. The entrance yawned before them, a jagged breach of concrete and frozen soil, rebar twisted outward like snapped tendons. According to the 1983 GRU construction diagrams, this bunker was never meant to be found. It did not exist on any military registry, had no fire exits, and no secondary entrances. It had been designed like a sarcophagus, both to protect and contain. Which begged the question Elena had been too afraid to voice out loud. What did they bury down there that required time itself to be tied down and gagged? They descended in a single-file line, their lamps cutting narrow cones through dust that drifted sideways rather than downward. Petrov cursed softly. Physics violated in plain sight offended him on a spiritual level. The deeper they moved into the bunker, the more oppressive the air became, weighted not with moisture or dust, but with the sensation of being watched by something that saw them not as intruders but as memories. The corridor sloped gently, though their instruments insisted it was level. Pipes ran overhead, some pristine, others rusted backward, metal flaking in reverse, corrosion reassembling itself grain by grain, like a wound stitching shut. The expedition recorded everything, yet the footage they captured behaved erratically. Timestamps ran in reverse. Audio logs contained echoes before the sounds that generated them. At 70 meters in, they found the first intact chamber. It had once been a monitoring station, the walls lined with analog equipment shaped like a Cold War imagination of the future. But what unnerved Elena was the condition of the room. The layer of dust was thick, decades thick, but beneath it, the footprints they made seconds ago began shrinking, fragmenting, and dissolving until the dust lay smooth again. Their presence was being erased as quickly as it was created. Taras, instead of recoiling, knelt to observe the phenomenon with scholarly delight. "Time is healing over us," he said, voice trembling with the intoxication of discovery. Elena wanted to shake him. But she couldn't deny it. The physical laws here were not merely distorted. They were obeying a logic that ran counter to everything known, a logic that had its own direction, its own momentum, its own hunger. A low hum vibrated through the walls, and the lights flickered, not the lamps they carried but the dormant fluorescence fixed to the ceiling, which sputtered briefly as if remembering how to be alive. Anya gasped and pointed to the far corner. There, half fused with the wall, was a chair. Or rather, the shape of one, a wooden form sinking backward through solid matter, splinters breaking, fibers reweaving, nails sliding upward from the concrete floor and into the joints as though undoing decades of decay. Mitya filmed in stunned silence. Elena approached, though each step felt like stepping deeper into a past that did not belong to her. "This isn't simple reversal," she murmured. "This is directionality. Selective directionality. Something wants this room to be earlier than it is." Taras added, almost reverently, "Or something inside it needs to return." They pressed further. The next chamber bore signs of a rapid and violent evacuation. Overturned metal tables, scattered tools, torn pages of documents written in bureaucratic Russian shorthand. But the chaos was unraveling itself. A wrench on the floor began to tremble, rotating slowly until it snapped back into a toolbox with a clean metallic click. A spilled cup of bitter, decades-old coffee began retreating into its container, stains fading from the floor in delicate tendrils. Then came the moment that froze them all. A brittle page, yellowed with age, smoothed itself, creases disappearing, ink brightening as if freshly printed. Mitya reached for it instinctively, but Elena grabbed his wrist. "Don't," she whispered. "If this process is rebuilding information, touching it could contaminate the sequence." He nodded, though reluctantly. As the page restored, words became legible. Temporal containment breach, protocol Chernikard, Black Walker. The GRU had a fondness for grandiose names, but something about that one made Elena's skin crawl. Beneath it, a line that chilled her blood. Subject demonstrates retrocausal influence at micro and macro levels. Physical proximity accelerates reversal field. Evacuation ordered. Then another line, shakier, handwritten. "We cannot let it reach zero." Taras read over her shoulder, eyes widening. 0 what? She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. A sharp crack split the air. Lights flickered again. The hum they'd heard earlier deepened, vibrating their ribs. The air thickened as though the bunker exhaled cold breath. Elena turned slowly, her lamp scanning the corridor behind them, and froze. Their own footprints, those from minutes earlier, were rising from the dust like pale, ghostly negatives. Then, one by one, they stepped backward across the floor, retracting toward the tunnel entrance. Not disappearing, performing. As though some invisible puppeteer was pulling time on a string, demonstrating that the expedition's presence here was not only known but actively being rewritten. Everyone to the central chamber, Elena said sharply. If this continues, the entrance might reverse itself shut. They moved fast now, urgency swallowing curiosity. The central chamber lay deeper still, past corridors where clocks mounted on the walls ticked not backward but sideways, their hands drifting in slow circles that obeyed no temporal logic. When they finally reached the main vault, a massive steel door forced open decades ago, they stopped as one. The room beyond was enormous. A sphere of reinforced glass and metal dominated its center, suspended by thick cables and machinery that had once hummed with power. Now the sphere pulsed faintly with a cold, bluish luminescence. Within it swirled something like vapor, but with structure, spiraling filaments of darkness rearranging themselves in slow, deliberate motions. Time was folding around it, collapsing inward like fabric tightening around a stone. Petrov whispered, "My God, they trapped it." Taras stepped forward. Or tried to. The sphere flickered. On its cracked surface, damage marks mended themselves, scratches smoothing out, fractures knitting into seamless transparency. Whatever was inside wanted the containment restored, not broken. Elena felt a pressure behind her eyes, like a whisper delivered directly into the skull, not words, but an invitation. Or a memory. Or both. The walls around the chamber began to shift. Rust flowed upward into clean steel. A toppled computer terminal rattled, then righted itself, screen flickering to life with green code that scrolled in reverse. Air vents expelled cold drafts that smelled like old antiseptic and fear. The bunker was not decaying. It was reclaiming itself, pulling the present into the past with violent determination. And at the center, the sphere continued to heal, eager to become whole. Elena approached until she stood just meters from it. The vapor within reacted, swirling faster, forming shapes reminiscent of limbs, then withdrawing. It was not a creature, at least not in any biological sense. It was a process, a phenomenon forced into confinement, a time engine running backward, a temporal parasite, a wound in causality. Behind her, footsteps crunched, then UN crunched, then crunched again. The reversal field was fluctuating wildly. "It's pulling us in," Tara said, voice trembling now for a different reason. "If we stay long enough, we'll be undone before we can leave. Not just dead, unmade." Elena nodded, but she couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the sphere, on the darkness inside it that seemed to pulse with a childlike curiosity. It reminded her of something, an old research paper she'd written years ago on retrocausal harmonics, in which she had speculated that certain extreme fields could seek informational equilibrium by reordering entropic pathways. The scientific way of saying, some anomalies want to rewrite the story until it makes sense to them. But this anomaly wasn't rewriting physics. It was rewriting its surroundings. The bunker. The objects. The timeline. And now, them. Suddenly, Tara shouted. Elena whirled around. Mitya was gone. No, he wasn't gone. He was halfway UN done. His body shimmered in a half-state, outlines dissolving and reforming as though his existence were being negotiated frame by frame. Anya screamed, stumbling toward him, but Elena grabbed her, dragging her back. "Do not touch him," she snapped. "If the field collapses around him, it'll take you too." Mitch's voice reached them, faint, warping like stretch tape. "I think I'm earlier." Then he folded inward like a vanishing thought. Anya fell to her knees, sobbing. Tara's look horrified, as if a lifetime of detached scientific bravado had suddenly shattered. Petrov backed toward the corridor, muttering prayers in a shaking voice. But Elena stood perfectly still. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because, for the first time, she understood what the handwritten note meant. "We cannot let it reach zero." Zero wasn't the anomaly's destruction. Zero was its birth. And if the sphere fully restored, if the bunker reversed to the moment the GRU first activated the anomaly, if time inside reached the initial state of containment, then everything that followed, including the shutdown, the escape, the warning, would never have happened. The past would overwrite the future. And whatever the anomaly had been evolving into since 1983, whatever it had learned trapped in this cage, it would be unleashed in the world with the innocence of a newborn and the power of a god. Elena swallowed hard, voice steady when she finally spoke. "We need to stop the reversal. Even if it means destroying the bunker. Even if it means we don't make it out." Tara stared at her, pale. "You mean killing ourselves to preserve a future we'll never see?" "No," Elena said softly. "Not killing ourselves. Choosing which version of us gets to exist." The bunker shuddered violently. The countdown to zero had begun. The bunker had begun to change its geometry in ways that defied both structural logic and psychological endurance. As the reversal intensified, the environment behaved less like a physical space and more like a living chronology folding back onto itself. Corridors lengthened or compressed depending on how far they had regressed in their temporal cycle. Concrete walls smoothed into the pristine brightness of newly poured material, and the cables overhead glistened with the sheen of copper still untouched by time. Every step the remaining members of the expedition took seemed to echo both forward and backward at once, as if each footfall created twin consequences in diverging temporal streams. Elena could feel the field brushing against her skin, a faint static prickle like cold hands tracing the edges of her memories. She realized that even her thoughts felt heavier, as though the anomaly were not only reshaping the world around her but also attempting to reorganize the sequence in which her own consciousness experienced itself. The sensation was subtle yet terrifying, the idea that her understanding of cause and effect might be the next thing to unravel. Anya followed with a grief-stricken emptiness, her face hollowed by the disappearance of her brother in a way that time would not allow to fully settle because emotional processing itself seemed slowed or reversed in patches. Moments earlier she had been shaking uncontrollably. Now she moved with a mechanical stillness as if certain emotional states had been undone or rolled back. Petrov, despite his training, appeared to be on the verge of panic, whispering fragmented observations under his breath and clutching his equipment case like a talisman against the unseen pressures pressing through the walls. Tara's walked slightly ahead, posture rigid, a man attempting to solve equations in his mind even as the variables were being erased or rewritten in real time. Elena recognized the expression, one she had worn many times, the desperate stubbornness of someone who thought logic could outpace the impossible. That illusion was dissolving now, thread by thread, and the bunker, if it could still be called that, seemed to recognize the moment of their unraveling with a kind of anticipatory hunger. As they ascended toward the auxiliary generator hall, the air became noticeably warmer, an unsettling counterpoint to the cold pulse that emanated from the containment sphere deeper below. This warmth carried a stale metallic tang, a scent that did not seem to belong to any specific decade, something caught between fresh circuitry and long-decayed machinery. The hall itself had reverted almost fully to its operational state. The backup generators now looked decades younger, their casings uncorroded, their surfaces reflecting the beams of the expedition's lamps with unnatural sharpness. What disturbed Elena most, however, was the faint rhythmic vibration beneath her boots, a sensation that indicated the generators were not simply appearing restored but were actually powering up. The reversal was reaching deeper than surface-level reassembly. It was restoring function, purpose, intention. It was trying to restart something that had once operated here, something that perhaps should never operate again. While the others assessed the hall with growing dread, Elena's mind pieced together the consequences. If the generators came fully online, they would feed power into the central chamber and the containment sphere, hastening the return to the bunker's initial chronological baseline. The anomaly would regain the environment it was born into, the machinery that had stabilized it, and the conditions that had once allowed it to grow. The notes recovered earlier hinted that the sphere had never truly been mastered. It had been a fragile equilibrium at best. The GRU scientists had believed they were controlling the anomaly, but the tone of the recovered report suggested otherwise. Containment had been a negotiation, not a victory. If the machinery restarted, the anomaly might not simply return to its original form. It might use that moment as a foundation to reach beyond it. In practical terms, the bunker was preparing a cradle for something that could reshape cause, memory, and reality into a structure that suited its own logic. Elena moved through the hall, analyzing every cable and control panel as though familiarity could protect her. She knew that to stop the reversal, they would need to sever the bunker's ability to regenerate itself. Destroying the generators was essential, yet nothing in the hall behaved like ordinary machinery anymore. A dismantled breaker plate reassembled itself in front of her eyes, metal reconstructing in a shimmering ripple. Taras made a gesture of frustration when a panel he had pried open sealed itself shut again, the screws sliding backward into place. The field in this part of the bunker was strong enough that entropy no longer obeyed natural rules. Destruction was merely a temporary state, always on the verge of being undone. They would need a way to disrupt the reversal not by force but by overwhelming it, by breaking the temporal sequence so violently that the anomaly could not reassert its preferred direction. The challenge intensified when the architectural structure itself began to distort in slow, nauseating waves. Portions of the ceiling briefly flickered between two states, one where fluorescent bulbs glowed with bluish-white luminescence, and another where bare cement beams stretched across the darkness with decades of dust. The floor vibrated in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing, as though the bunker's timeline were expanding and contracting with each pulse from the sphere far below. This fluctuation made navigation increasingly disorienting. Turning a corner could lead to a version of the corridor from 30 years earlier, then from 20 years earlier, then from minutes earlier. Anya stumbled at one point when the ground beneath her shifted into an unpoured trench, then re-solidified into finished flooring before she could fall. Petrov stared at the distortion with mounting horror, muttering that the space was cannibalizing its own history. Through this shifting world, Elena kept her focus. She pushed the team toward the deepest part of the generator hall where the central junction node resided, a heavy, shielded control tower that fed power throughout the bunker. Traditionally, such a node would be the heart of the electrical system. In their current temporal nightmare, it had become something more like a spine, an anchoring point to which the reversal field was returning the bunker's internal chronology. If they could disrupt it, if they could sever the bunker's capacity to rebuild itself from the past, they might halt the return to zero. It would not be simple. The field around the junction was strong enough that any tool they used might break itself before it made contact. But Elena believed there was a way, An overload triggered not by physical destruction but by pushing the system into a contradiction so severe that the reversal could not reconcile it. The problem was that contradictions in a world where time ran backward were inherently dangerous. Creating one might sever not only the machinery but also their own continuity. Elena knew this and weighed it silently against the alternative. If the anomaly returned to its point of origin unimpeded, the consequences would extend far beyond the bunker. The reversal could expand outward, dragging the surrounding region into its temporal vacuum, unspooling whole lives, erasing events, rewriting sequences. Human civilization depended on causality as its unspoken foundation. The anomaly represented an inversion of that foundation, a pressure that sought to remake reality in the shape of reverse consequence. As they approached the junction node, the field intensified to a degree that made breathing difficult. The air felt thick, heavy with a sensation like walking through an invisible liquid. Vision blurred at the edges. Elena could feel her heartbeat slowing and accelerating unpredictably, as though time was tugging at her internal rhythms. The hall's lights flashed in irregular patterns, some illuminating fragments of the past, a discarded boot, a pile of tools, a cigarette still burning despite being decades old, while others revealed an empty expanse as though portions of the future had been erased. The world felt less like a cohesive environment and more like a deck of shuffled moments, each vying for dominance. Elena signaled for Taras to examine the node with her, though the gesture was more instinct than communication since words had become nearly impossible to form in the thickening distortion. He understood and joined her, their combined knowledge forming the last coherent framework of reasoning in a place where logic was dissolving. They studied the node as its panels rippled between states of assembly and disassembly. Elena realized that the reversal field, while powerful, was not uniform. It pulsed outward from the containment sphere in irregular waves, each one carrying slightly different intensity and direction. If they timed their actions between those pulses, they might have a narrow opportunity during which the node behaved like an ordinary piece of machinery rather than an immortal artifact of shifting chronology. Anya and Petrov remained further back, partially shielded from the worst effects of the field. Anya's expression carried a mixture of grief and numb determination, as if her brother's disappearance had become a fixed knot in her mind that no amount of temporal distortion could dissolve. Petrov fought to maintain composure, repeating structural terms in a steady rhythm as though anchoring himself with familiarity. His presence remained essential. The node's physical destruction would require precise timing and maximum force. When one of the reversal pulses passed, the node stabilized for a moment. Taras seized the chance to access a partially restored interface, scanning the ancient readouts that flickered across its analog screens. Elena observed the numbers reverse, then stabilize, then reverse again, caught between two competing temporal states. Her mind worked furiously. There had to be a flaw, a moment where the reversal created an unsustainable condition the system could not correct. She realized suddenly that the node's internal circuitry was caught in a loop. It was trying to revert to a configuration that had not yet been constructed in the timeline they now occupied. The system was attempting to restore a future that the reversal had temporarily removed. It was an impossible state, and impossible states could be exploited. She gestured urgently to Petrov, indicating the exact point where the system was struggling to reconcile its own contradictory history. He moved closer, gripping a heavy industrial tool, despite the risk that it would unbreak itself. Elena waited for the next pulse, sensing it more than measuring it, a rhythmic pressure that tugged faintly at her awareness. When the pulse passed and the node flickered into coherence, she gave the signal. Petrov struck the exposed regulation core with all his strength. For a heartbeat, the metal deformed, sparks leaped outward, and the hall vibrated violently as though the entire bunker cried out in pain. Then the reversal pulse returned. But this time, instead of undoing the blow, The pulse hit the node at the precise moment when its internal chronology was fractured. The reversal field attempted to drag the system backward into a state that no longer existed. The node twisted inward on itself in a cascade of collapsing timelines, its surfaces flickering with rapid sequences of past and future states. An impossible contradiction formed at its center, a point where time could not decide which version of itself to preserve. The system imploded in silence. Every light in the hall flickered. The warmth dissipated. The air grew still, heavy with anticipation. For a moment, the bunker hung in a fragile equilibrium, as though waiting for a verdict. The generators died. The reversal paused. Far below, in the containment chamber, the sphere pulsed once, slowly, like a heartbeat deciding whether to continue. The bunker had not yet chosen a timeline. But the anomaly had begun to notice the interruption, and the world around them prepared to shift again. The first impression of the underground facility was not one of revelation but of absolute procedural familiarity, the kind that made its discovery more disturbing than anything that relied on shock. Lavrov expected the bunker to reflect chaos or abandonment, yet what they encountered resembled the residue of an institution that had attempted to hide its own failure through order rather than destruction. The floors bore the dull sheen of old industrial polish, scuffed by decades of boots marching according to schedules now extinct. The air tasted faintly metallic, like a room sealed too long with aging wiring and stale filtration systems. Every piece of furniture, from the metal desks arranged in rigid rows to the wall-mounted filing cabinets bolted into concrete, seemed positioned according to rules that had once been enforced with relentless consistency. The bunker presented itself as a place no one intended to revisit, yet no one had dared dismantle. It was not forgotten. It was deliberately preserved, the way an institution preserves anything that cannot be allowed to surface again. This atmosphere established the emotional tenor of the discovery long before any document was opened. The horror was administrative, not physical, an accumulation of decisions, omissions, and unspoken intentions. The team advanced deeper into the complex in a formation that reflected neither military discipline nor scientific enthusiasm but the quiet caution of individuals who sensed that each new corridor might reveal an aspect of the past meant to remain sealed. Elena moved with measured steps, her flashlight sliding across the uneven stacks of papers left atop desks. Some sheets had curled with age, their edges brittle, the typewritten ink fading inconsistently as though certain words were retreating from being read again. These inconsistencies mirrored the psychological burden of the place. Every detail carried the weight of something withheld. Lavrov noted that many of the cabinets bore classification labels that had been scraped off with deliberate imprecision, leaving behind patches of adhesive and faint imprints of letters that could be deciphered only through close inspection. The walls, too, bore scars of institutional reconfiguration, holes where plaques had been removed, outlines of shelves dismantled yet never fully unbolted, residue from adhesive seals used to restrict access. Everything indicated a facility that had undergone a formal shutdown procedure, but not destruction. Someone had ensured that the past remained intact yet inaccessible, as if awaiting the right, or wrong, observer. The core archive room broke the illusion of abandonment in a way that no dramatic event could. It resembled the archetype of a functioning bureaucratic office, rows of metal shelves burdened with folders labeled in typed Cyrillic, stacks of carbon copies secured with rusted paperclips, and binders bulging with charts drawn according to technical standards of a previous era. The uniformity of the handwriting on the logs suggested an office where clerks worked under sustained pressure, guided by deadlines that were never explained to them. Lavrov stepped carefully, conscious not to disturb anything, though he knew the dust patterns already marked them as intruders. He examined the first accessible desk, where notes lay arranged in a manner that suggested the final occupant had intended to return before being forced to leave. On one page, A typed report described irregularities in time inversion measurements with a tone so detached that it resembled a weather bulletin rather than a summary of impossible phenomena. The language framed temporal reversal as a manageable operational variable, noted alongside voltage fluctuations and mechanical vibration tolerances. This neutrality conveyed the institutional mindset more effectively than any testimony could: the capacity to categorize the incomprehensible as a logistical concern. The expedition moved slowly as they absorbed the implications of what they were reading. Elena reviewed the personnel logs with growing unease. She recognized the patterns of compartmentalization: teams divided into units unaware of each other's roles, shifts reassigned without justification, clearance levels updated with dates that appeared inconsistent with recorded events. Some logs contained annotations in red pencil, marking decisions to suspend a particular researcher or relocate an entire subdepartment. None of these notes included reasoning. Instead, the phrasing reflected the opacity typical of Soviet-era bureaucratic corrective measures: efficiency adjustments, compliance restructuring, internal realignment. Such terminology mapped a psychological landscape where dissent was invisible, and consequences appeared without warning. Elena understood that behind these euphemisms lay the realities of coercion, fear, and institutional enforcement. The bunker had not simply facilitated scientific experimentation, it had embodied the structure that governed and concealed it. Kirill approached the technical logs with an engineer's discomfort, scanning diagrams of devices designed to monitor reversed temporal flow. He paused when he encountered references to calibration intervals measured not by chronological time but by inverted sequences of event markers. The notion that instruments could register events in reverse order seemed to violate the conceptual basis of measurement itself. He felt the disorientation of acknowledging a system that contradicted the foundations of his training. More unsettling was the possibility that the team's physical presence in the bunker, their breathing, movement, and observation, could influence, or distort, the inversion phenomena documented within the archive. The reports hinted that human interaction with the temporal field could produce unintended consequences, yet these warning notes appeared only in the margins, written hastily in a different hand, as though added by someone who suspected that the formal reports were insufficiently cautious. Kirill felt this as a silent accusation. Their investigation might already be altering the very history they were attempting to decode. Timur, far younger and with fewer defenses against the ideological implications, experienced a more immediate rupture. He read early reports describing subjects placed in sealed chambers, aging in reverse as the temporal field intensified. The factual tone of the documents offered no emotional interpretation, no moral framing, only technical analysis of physiological changes, behavioral regressions, and eventual disappearance. For Timur, the horror stemmed from the systematic detachment with which these events were recorded. He imagined the personnel who had witnessed such transformations, forced to document them without reaction, compelled by the institutional environment to treat the impossible as routine. This perspective was amplified by his recognition that the team itself now stood in a similar position, caught between comprehension and procedure, aware that acknowledging their fear could weaken their coherence as a group. The archive did not merely reveal the past, it revealed the psychological architecture that had produced and concealed it. As the hours passed, the archive began to shift in meaning. What had initially appeared as a collection of classified documents now resembled a living map of institutional will. Lavrov compiled a mental inventory of the contradictions. Reports dated after the program was officially suspended, personnel files referencing individuals no longer present in later logs, equipment requisitions approved despite overlapping shutdown orders. These anomalies pointed to a period in which the bunker continued to operate covertly, staffed by personnel who either lacked awareness of its closure or were instructed to pretend ignorance. The deeper the team read, the more apparent it became that the shutdown had been staged to satisfy an oversight committee, while a smaller, more insulated group continued the experiments. This realization unsettled Lavrov profoundly. It suggested that the inversion program had not collapsed because of technical failure alone, but because the institution had fractured internally, its secrecy becoming unsustainable even for those who maintained it. The psychological impact intensified once the expedition began conducting internal interrogations, conversations framed not as accusations but as attempts to clarify timelines, responsibilities, and interpretations. These interrogations happened quietly, behind closed doors, motivated not by distrust but by the necessity to verify who had read which documents and who had drawn which conclusions. Lavrov initiated these sessions with a restrained manner that reflected both his authority and reluctance. He understood the danger of appearing to single out individuals, yet he also recognized the danger of proceeding without shared knowledge. The institutional patterns reflected in the archive influenced their behavior. Each member weighed their words as though speaking in an environment where silence could be interpreted as resistance and clarity could be used against them. Elena noticed the shift first. Team members hesitated before answering even benign questions, their pauses growing longer, their posture more guarded. The bunker's logic had begun to imprint itself onto them. Reassignments followed, though none were framed as such. 2 expedition members, assistants assigned to logistical tasks, were instructed to return to the surface on the pretext of environmental monitoring duties. The orders lacked signatures, dates, or explanation. Lavrov saw through the pretext but complied, understanding that forcing a confrontation could destabilize the group. The departure of these members left an absence that intensified the bunker's psychological pressure. The corridors felt quieter, as though the facility absorbed the removal of personnel with an indifference that mirrored its treatment of the past. Elena expressed her unease indirectly, noting inconsistencies in the new task schedules. Kirill attempted to maintain procedural focus, but his notes grew more fragmented. Timur avoided eye contact, uncertain whether speaking his fears could be construed as violating the implicit pact that held the team together. The emotional rupture surfaced not through overt conflict, but through the subtle fractures that accumulated as each individual processed the archive's revelations in private. Lavrov found his hand shaking slightly when signing a revised confidentiality directive, the tremor noticeable only because he had maintained decades of composure under far more volatile circumstances. Elena hesitated before opening new folders, as though acknowledging certain information might commit her to implications she could not articulate. Kirill lingered in the equipment room longer than necessary, attempting to reconcile the technical logic of the instruments with the impossible nature of the field. Timur grew increasingly quiet, carrying himself with the guarded stillness of someone who had seen something he could not yet admit to himself. Each reaction was suppressed, contained, shaped by the institutional etiquette they had absorbed through years of working within systems that valued compliance above expression. The archive itself became the central rupture, not a dramatic revelation but a steadily accumulating body of evidence that exposed the cost of institutional secrecy. The documents revealed a history the system had attempted to bury not through destruction but through controlled concealment. Now that the expedition had uncovered it, they had entered a psychological zone where truth could neither be ignored nor spoken openly. The cost of acknowledging it felt immense, a weight distributed unevenly among them. Lavrov sensed that their understanding of the bunker had shifted irreversibly. They were no longer investigators or scientists. They had become witnesses to a past that had shaped itself into a structure capable of influencing the present. By the time they completed their review, the discovery no longer felt like an academic or technical achievement. It felt like an intrusion into a suppressed narrative the institution had once decided must remain permanently hidden. The GRU documents did not simply chronicle the inversion program. They embodied the system's ability to define what was real, what could be known, and what must disappear. To confront them was to confront the mechanism of erasure itself. The bunker remained silent as they stepped away from the archive, yet its silence seemed loaded with an unspoken expectation, as if waiting to see whether they would uphold the patterns of omission that had governed its past. The team did not voice their conclusions, but the weight of the discovery pressed heavily against the unsteady equilibrium that held them together. They had reached the point where knowledge carried a cost their training had never prepared them to bear. The days following the expedition's departure from the bunker assume a rhythm so subdued and unremarkable that it becomes immediately clear the quiet is not a natural return to routine but an enforced condition designed to replace the memory of the anomaly with procedural fatigue. The research station in location receives them with the same dull fluorescence and the same low-frequency hum of generators, yet the environment feels subtly displaced, as though the landscape has been adjusted by increments too small for the eye but large enough for the mind to sense something amiss. Offices that once held familiar stacks of reports and field maps now display new inventory lists with formatting inconsistent with the previous system, suggesting that some administrative hand has been at work reshaping their operational context. Shelves hold binders labeled with dates that do not align with the researchers' recollections, and supply logs contain signatures that none of them remember providing. These minor discrepancies accumulate without acknowledgement, creating an atmosphere in which the boundaries between accurate memory and institutional revision become increasingly porous. Whatever the expedition expected to confront upon returning from the GRU bunker, they quickly understand that the real work has already begun without them, the work of transforming the anomaly into a bureaucratic non-event. Lavrov moves through this environment with a muted deliberation that mirrors his earlier caution, yet now his composure carries an undertone of disorientation that he cannot fully externalize. He senses that documents he handled only days prior no longer exist in their original form, replaced by sanitized versions that omit critical details and that bear the unmistakable mark of administrative rewriting. Reports that once referenced temporal inversion now make only vague suggestions about instrument irregularities or non-reproducible measurements, as if the entire bunker had been reclassified as a technical malfunction rather than a historical rupture. His attempts to reconcile the current documentation with his memories leave him with an unsettling realization. The institution does not need to conceal the discovery through overt suppression. It can simply overwrite the context until the anomaly becomes indistinguishable from routine. Each morning he encounters new directives that appear to resolve issues he never raised, policies that address conditions he does not remember existing, and revisions to procedural guidelines that imply outcomes he cannot verify. The effect is cumulative, leaving him uncertain whether the changes reflect actual administrative intervention or whether the instability of time encountered in the bunker has followed him into the present, subtly altering the world to mask the very phenomenon he witnessed. Elena, who had read the archival testimonies in the bunker with increasing tension, now adopts a posture of studied neutrality that echoes the survival strategies of those who understand institutional silence intimately. Her manner becomes more deliberate. Papers are handled with careful precision, observations are recorded without subjective qualifiers, and her interactions with colleagues are shaped by an almost formal detachment. Although she never articulates her conclusions, it becomes evident that she interprets the administrative rewriting as an expected but deeply consequential step. She has spent enough time studying patterns of suppression in Soviet bureaucratic culture to recognize that what they are experiencing is not a unique response to an extraordinary discovery but a continuation of long-established protocols. The past is being restructured in real time, and her role within this new landscape is to maintain the appearance of compliance while quietly marking the moments where documented reality diverges from lived experience. Her silence is not a withdrawal but a method of preserving the fragments of truth that have not yet been fully absorbed by institutional redaction. Kirill, who once grappled with the technical implications of instruments capable of tracking reverse temporal flow, now turns his attention to routine tasks with an intensity that borders on mechanical. He recalibrates equipment repeatedly, reviews maintenance schedules with rigid discipline, and adheres to checklists that no longer serve any practical function but offer a fragile sense of continuity. The contrast between his earlier curiosity and his current behavior suggests that he views the normalization of routine as the only available defense against the uncertainty that has infiltrated every layer of their work. In private moments he appears unsettled by discrepancies in the equipment logs, entries that indicate tests he does not recall performing, calibration data that contradicts his own measurements, and timestamps that appear in sequences inconsistent with linear time. Yet he avoids confronting these inconsistencies directly, perhaps recognizing that any attempt to question them could be interpreted as resistance or instability. Instead, he clings to procedure, hoping that adherence to established patterns will anchor him in a timeline that no longer feels entirely secure. Timur, the youngest member of the expedition, undergoes the sharpest shift as the implications of the anomaly manifest in his withdrawal from both professional and informal interactions. Initially, he attempts to engage with the administrative rewritings, asking quiet questions about missing reports or inconsistencies in mission summaries, but the lack of acknowledgement from superiors and colleagues alike soon convinces him that raising concerns is a futile effort. His silence grows heavier with each passing day, and his posture adopts a defensive quality, as though he expects some undefined consequence for speaking too openly about events that no longer exist in official records. He begins spending long hours alone in peripheral rooms of the research station, reviewing notes that appear increasingly incomplete, as if the very act of documenting the anomaly has been undermined by temporal interference or by institutional erasure. His diminishing confidence in the stability of both time and authority becomes visible in the cautious precision of his movements, revealing a growing awareness that the institution cannot protect him from the implications of what they witnessed. The official communications that arrive from central authorities deepen the atmosphere of displacement. Each message is composed in language so polished and carefully structured that the omissions become more telling than the content. Statements congratulating the expedition on the successful completion of field operations are paired with assurances that no anomalous findings require further review, creating an official narrative that effectively seals the bunker and its contents behind a wall of administrative indifference. The documents bear signatures from departments not originally associated with the expedition, implying that the rewriting process involves individuals far beyond their immediate chain of command. Some messages reference safety protocols that were never enacted, as though the institution has inserted fictional procedures into the historical record to retroactively justify its decisions. The effect is unsettling, creating a temporal paradox in which the present contains memories of events that official documents insist never occurred. Lavrov increasingly senses that even his internal recollection is becoming unstable. He notices subtle shifts in his memory of the bunker's layout, the sequence of their discoveries, and the contents of specific archival reports. Although he attempts to verify his memories through cross-referencing field notes, he finds that some pages have been replaced with versions containing slight but consequential differences, dates altered by a single digit, headings reformatted, or footnotes removed. These changes appear trivial but collectively suggest an erosion of the boundary between actual memory and institutional substitution. He begins to question whether the temporal inversion they encountered is exerting a lingering influence, not in the dramatic manner described in the GRU documents, but through a more diffuse destabilization that renders chronology unreliable. The possibility that the team has returned to a timeline subtly altered by their presence in the bunker becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. Elena maintains her quiet vigilance, observing the shifts in documentation with the precision of someone cataloging a historical pattern. She notices that some personnel files have been updated with new details, including revised dates of employment and altered project affiliations. She also observes that the expedition roster has been retroactively modified, 2 members who were sent back under unclear orders appear to have been reassigned long before the mission, according to the new records. The rewriting extends even to logistical documents, such as supply manifests and resource allocation charts. These changes do not erase the past entirely but blur its edges, making it increasingly challenging to distinguish between genuine events and administratively manufactured versions of them. Her expression reveals neither shock nor resignation, but a deep and methodical awareness that the institution has entered the final phase of its containment strategy, the phase in which memory itself becomes a manageable variable. Kirill confronts the rewritten documentation through his technical role, noting inconsistencies in data storage protocols and archival timestamps. He discovers that certain datasets have been restructured according to new classification systems that did not exist during the mission, implying retroactive reorganization designed to obscure the origins of specific entries. Some logs contain references to equipment malfunctions he never observed, while others omit entire sequences of experimental readings from the bunker. His attempts to reconcile these patterns lead him to a quiet but profound conclusion. The institution does not need to deny the existence of the anomaly. It merely needs to produce sufficient administrative noise to drown out any coherent account of it. By fragmenting the documentary trail into contradictory versions, the system ensures that no single narrative can emerge, effectively dissolving the anomaly within a cloud of procedural uncertainty. Timur's withdrawal deepens in response to the widening gap between memory and documentation. He becomes increasingly reluctant to participate in team briefings, aware that his recollections diverge from the official narrative, and fearful that acknowledging this divergence could be interpreted as an inability to maintain professional composure. He revisits his personal notes repeatedly, discovering changes that he cannot explain, ink fading unevenly, phrases appearing in handwriting that resembles his own but with subtle differences, or page sequences rearranged. These alterations undermine his confidence not only in institutional stability but in the reliability of his own memory. He begins to experience the world as a series of unconnected moments, each shaped by the knowledge that the timeline he occupies may be only one of several possible outcomes of their encounter with the reverse temporal flow. The narrative atmosphere tightens as the institution completes its rewriting of the expedition's history. Updated mission summaries arrive that outline a version of events stripped of all essential content, describing only routine geological assessments and uneventful field observations. Personnel evaluations are revised to emphasize professionalism and adherence to protocol, with no reference to the emotional or cognitive strain caused by the anomaly. Equipment inventories list all instruments as functioning within normal parameters, eliminating any trace of the disruptions recorded in the bunker. Through this process, the discovery is not denied but absorbed into a vast structure of administrative normalization, its existence preserved only in the unspoken tension carried by the remaining team members. The final tone emerges through a quiet, persistent ambiguity. Although the team has exited the bunker, the temporal instability they encountered continues to shape their perceptions and their sense of historical continuity. Lavrov moves through his days with the knowledge that the world he now inhabits may not be the same one he left, a realization that becomes part of his routine rather than an anomaly. Elena carries the fragmented truth with the steadiness of someone who understands that unrecorded knowledge must be protected through silence rather than disclosure. Kirill maintains his instruments with a precision that borders on ritual, aware that technical consistency may be the only anchor left in a shifting reality. Timur retreats into an internal landscape shaped by the recognition that institutional protection cannot extend into regions where time itself refuses to remain stable. What remains of the expedition's experience persists only in fragments, unspoken recollections, momentary flashes of memory, and the quiet awareness shared by those who survived the anomaly. The institution absorbs the discovery through omission, procedural rewriting, and the steady pressure of administrative routine, leaving behind a world in which the truth is neither fully hidden nor fully present. The narrative closes with the recognition that something fundamental has shifted, not only within the bunker but within the fabric of their lives and the timeline they now occupy. The echo of the anomaly endures, growing quieter with each passing day yet never fully disappearing, a reminder that time, once disrupted, cannot be restored without leaving traces that no amount of bureaucratic revision can entirely erase.